Hello?
You're live.
Awesome. All right. One sec. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Sean Collard. I work as a system security engineer at Centauri. I've been here for about 4 months, and I'm here with two of my coworkers, James Hardy, who's here with me on the video, and Jeremy Porter, who's here to answer questions in the chat. James, do you want to introduce yourself quick?
Hi, my name is James Hardy. I'm working at Centauri as a system security engineer as well. I work a lot with penetration testing, and I'm also looking into hardware exploitations on the current projects that we're working on.
All right, cool. As for my work, I work in implementation for security for our systems at Centauri, working with multiple teams under our bosses for our tape outs. So to get started, I want to present you guys something about hardware security and what hardware security is and how important it is. So to start off, what is hardware security not? There's multiple forms of security in different areas of computer technology. We have IT security, which is protection of computers along with supporting data storage and communications infrastructure. Example, this is firewalls. That is one example of IT security. We have software security, which is protection of computer code such that it operates correctly despite malicious attack. And form of this could be encryption. We have data security, which is protection of private, sensitive, or privileged data from unauthorized use or alteration. And we also have strict hardware bug detection, which is errors in the execution of design leading to security vulnerabilities. Hardware security is not related to all these different things. Hardware security is its own separate thing. However, it is very related to these different forms of security as they can play a role into later stages of hardware security. So what is hardware security actually? Hardware security is the protection of electronics hardware against attacks aimed at compromising resident data, operations, or design. Vulnerabilities are more persistent than software-based ones. So with hardware security, it's the lowest level that you can go. That's where if somebody is to access the hardware, they basically have access to everything. Trying to patch hardware is very difficult. In fact, is not feasible. We have to go through different methods to try and patch this up. It's not something where you can just correct the software and in an instant you have a fix for it. This is completely different. Yeah. There's also another form of hardware security where we have integrated hardware security, which is the protection implemented on integrated circuits to protect the resident data, operations, and design.
Yeah, this is probably the most expensive thing to try and fix because you will be refabricating everything if you find an exploit through hardware, either through something like a UART port or any other piece of hardware where they can gain access to data that they should not have access to.
Mm-hmm. To give you an idea of it, let's say that we're building a processor. If there's a flaw in the hardware design, we essentially have to go back and redesign the processor and recreate it with the new security patch. We can't just go in and recreate the hardware from before, because once it's created, which means that we have to spend time, money, and more resources to try and create the new patch for it. So why is hardware security so important? Well, multiple forms of technology are growing as the years go by. One example is in automobiles. So with self-driving cars and more advances in technology in cars advancing, more pieces of hardware are going to be implemented. We have RFIDs with car IDs. We have sensors such as LiDARs connecting to IMUs, which are inertial measurement units, that are processing data inside the car to be used for things such as location tracking. So we have all this information being stored in one central location. Dangers is that if this piece of hardware is hacked, then multiple different things could happen, such as we could have people that could control the vehicle from a remote location and basically kidnap people trying to impersonate as somebody trying to pick them up, such as children, women, or other men. Another issue could be that somebody could find out the location information where people go on a daily basis, such as where they go to work, where their home is, and other such important information. So with this, we have to keep in mind how can we prevent people from getting into the system? So this is why hardware security is so important. As I mentioned before, hardware security is probably the biggest points out of all the security points, because if you access the hardware, you get access to everything. So an example of this is the Syrian radar system back in the mid to the late 2000s. So what happened was the Syrian government had a radar system to detect missile launches. They were getting attacked by missiles from Israel, and what happened was they weren't able to figure out where the missiles coming from, because somebody in the Israel government was able to do a side channel attack into the hardware and mess their system up such that they couldn't track where the missile was and they were able to get hit. So things like this are very important to prevent, but are also very hard to prevent because you need to be able to figure out what the issue is. The problem with hardware security is that you're trying to prevent all the different sources of bugs from happening, whereas the attacker just needs one source to enter and obtain all the information or mess the system up entirely.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this also comes with the task of verification, because if the person that is synthesizing this hardware for you in mass in some production facility does something incorrectly or ports over your file incorrectly, and which leads to vulnerabilities, you will have to verify that all of their runs are not vulnerable as well.
This also leads to more infrastructure being needed, as hardware security is still brand new, probably being mostly developed in the last decade. So multiple teams and multiple facilities are still needing to be created to develop this field. So hardware security is very important to keep in mind. So what are some instances of hardware security threats? So Chinese phones, such as ones from Huawei, are being hacked into to leak people's information from them. In 2015, 43% of security threats were from hardware and software. US fined ZTE, another phone company from China, $1.19 billion for breaching sanctions due to hardware security vulnerabilities. Multiple forms of hardware security are being brought up. These two, Spectre and Meltdown, were founded mostly in 2018. Two large hardware security threats that impacted Intel processors and other brand processors. Spectre, an attack vector that takes advantage of faulty clamp due to speculative execution. So, as a quick recap for those who have taken computer architecture, speculative execution is a control flow method that increases performance by allowing the CPU to guess the direction of a path. So the basic example is if we have an if statement, the CPU tries to guess which path it's going to go down, if it's going to execute the if statement or not, and tries to take the fastest path. If the faster path is wrong, it cleans up everything it did and goes down the slower path. However, what was found was that the cleanup due to not taking the correct path wasn't a full cleanup. Certain things were still cached and were still accessible, which allowed for Spectre to take place, since it could use this faulty cleanup to access insecure data. Meltdown, an attack vector that breaks down the barriers between different access levels, such as using a kernel, by abusing race conditions. For anybody that's taken an operating system course, you should know that race conditions are what happen when the processes or the threads inside a program are basically trying to execute something but might get different results due to timing. So why is this bad? Well, if a program goes into the kernel level to try and access data, but is brought to user level because something is not executed properly, such as a exception being brought up, then the user has access to kernel level information. This is also another reason why hardware security is needed to prevent this sort of information being breached from these two attack vectors. This is a graph of all the different cases of Spectre and Meltdown breaching into people's CPU and accessing insecure data. It is things like this where we need to prevent in the coming future, such that we can A, protect people's data, B, make more secure efforts here in the US instead of sending out information across the globe. And C, it would help save large amounts of time and money in creating our own pieces of hardware fabrication. So with that, I'll go ahead and take any questions.
Yeah. I want to leave a good spot of time open for questions because majority of this is how you guys plan to apply it in comparison to, because we can give you a bunch of techniques, but a lot of them will get lost unless you're planning to apply them. You might want to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah, we see you there, Jeremy.
Like anyone is in the chat currently saying anything?
I know that was a bit of a quicker presentation, but hardware security is very brand new, and I didn't want to flood everybody with a large amount of information.
Yeah, and both Sean and I will be here if you guys do need help with that during the mentorship part. So it doesn't look like there are any questions coming up. I guess we could just sit here for the rest of the 15 minutes.
Yeah. You watching the YouTube right now?
Mm-hmm. So is this something you guys actively work on at Centauri? Yes, we both are actively working on that. I'm currently working with the penetration testing team. We're both looking to, basically we're looking at the SoC that we are making, and we're looking for any software and hardware vulnerabilities that we can exploit so that once we find these exploitations, we can pass them down the chain and then they will get removed in either the way that the software is implemented or in the actual physical makeup of the chip.
Yeah, and as far as what I do, so like I mentioned before, I work on the implementation of how everything is put in. So I'm kind of like the first layer of what goes through. I try and make sure that everybody's implemented their things correctly, and then it goes to James's team, who tries to make sure that there are no faults in it.
And then if there are faults, we kind of send it back up, and we're like, "Hey, can you get rid of this? There's an issue here," you know.
It's kind of like a game of tower defense where I'm trying to make sure that our things are secure, and James is trying to capture the flag from inside the tower.
Yeah. I know cybersecurity is currently a buzzword in the computer science world. Do big companies have hardware security teams as they do that of cybersecurity?
I'd say that. So I'd probably agree that cybersecurity is more of a buzzword, but it's, again, as in that first slide, cybersecurity is not hardware security. I feel like it's something that's not as much talked about because when you think of cybersecurity, you think of software, you don't think of hardware. So
he was asking whether we have hardware security teams as they do have cybersecurity teams in other companies. Like outside of our company, do other big companies have hardware security teams?
That I'm not sure of because I'm still brand new to the field. I would probably not think so because hardware security is still relatively brand new in terms of a topic.
Yeah, a majority of companies out there, like newer startups at the very least, will definitely not really think about the hardware they're using, especially when you outsource it to countries like China and such. They don't really, kind of assume fabrication goes well, and they kind of leave that open to you'll use more off-the-shelf components and assume those are secure. I guess when you get into larger level companies, things like Intel, Centauri, and stuff like that, people that are actually developing and simulating the hardware beforehand and running it through tests and all that, the same that we are, that you definitely will see more hardware security teams, but the actual concept of hardware security and the actual strides that are being made in the field are, as you said, relatively brand new to the current decade.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely depends on the company, depends on what they're doing, but there's a lot more companies that are looking into that. Especially when you go to things like, you see things like DEF CON, where they literally are able to break open tons of like TVs and radios and all that, and they can just get access to the kernel or get access to root within like 5 minutes.
Yeah, because that is one of the issues, is that a lot of methods used, such as with speculative execution, were assumed to be safe. But as time went on, it was found out to be a faulty method, and then we have to go back up and clean that sort of process up again.
Andrew, I do agree that there are a lot of defense companies that have hardware teams. You need a hardware team for a majority of what big companies do. But the hardware security aspect is what is is the newer thing, because before a lot of people would design the hardware so that it works, and then they worry about the software being the issue. But now there's a lot of things that we're seeing that malicious actors would be able to go into the hardware and then use that to alter the lower level software and all the user level permissions and such.
I think one thing I should definitely bring up is with what a lot of companies in America do, kind of like what James mentioned, is that we use China to fabricate our hardware designs because it's much cheaper to do it over there. But in the process, we can't really control what's actually being developed with the hardware, what they're actually putting in it. So what might happen, and what's been found in a lot of these cases, is that they'll put an extra little something in there where they can activate it, and it can change the hardware dramatically to where it can either mess it up or leak people's information.
So there's another question. Do you work with neuromorphic chips, or apply AI on hardware? We currently don't. I believe one of the people in our team is working on some machine learning project, but currently we don't have anything on chip that is an AI coprocessor or otherwise. A majority of the time, I believe ours is working with, like, you technically could use the systems that we make to, on a software level, synthesize something like a neural network, or just any AI from a symbolic AI perspective, but it's not in the hardware. Is it not possible to patch hardware vulnerabilities using software methods?
I would think not, because a lot of hardware vulnerabilities, such as side channel attacks or implemented pieces of hardware that you don't know about, so it's very hard to go in and patch it up, because if you try and move it from the current hardware system, it would probably drastically change it, and trying to patch it with software would become tedious and wouldn't be robust.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
The firmware, what Jeremy's saying, firmware is definitely the direction that you'd want to go with that, because that kind of so firmware. So you've got hardware, which is the physical, software, which is virtual, and then firmware is the kind of in between. Firmware is the software that basically tells the hardware what to do. So the reason that firmware would be able to possibly patch these hardware security issues is because it can do things like redirect information flow or run checks on information flow and stuff like that. Or basically it designates what devices get what permissions and stuff like that. And just things like using semaphores to create locks and disallowing certain pieces of information access to certain pieces of the system. A lot of the time, that firmware in and of itself tends to be a lot faultier per se. Like it's a lot easier because if you find one exploitation in hardware and then you fix it with firmware, that exploitation is still technically an avenue. You've just worked around it. So a lot of the time you want to just rework the hardware so that you don't have to keep working around that same, because it's still technically a hole that was exploited before. There might still be that opening. Yeah, it is basically a Band-Aid fix.
Yeah.
You almost always want to go into the hardware and fix it. You normally would only do firmware updates if you've already pushed it to market and there's tons of people out there, because then you can throw out this firmware and update, have everyone run through that, and then it puts a little Band-Aid fix on it, you know. Any other questions from anyone? Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We'll still be here. We still have a bit of time, so
Yeah. You as well. Hey, also have a great weekend.
Oh, thanks guys. Y'all have a good weekend too. Good luck on your projects.
Yeah, if you do have any more questions, feel free to reach out. I don't know when you start your mentoring, Sean, but I think we'll be here for most of the night.
Yeah, I start at 6.
Yeah, I'm probably gonna start around that same time. Yeah, and if you can't find us in like the mentor, I think you can. I don't know if they have the ability in the Slack channel, but they should be able to shoot us like a private message or something like that. If
Yeah,
they just don't want to put it in the general chat. Okay, yeah, they can. So, I assume no more questions, or do we want to stay? What's happening?
I should be safe by like until 5 o'clock.
Yeah, sure.